Introduce Natasha Hausdorff, who is a barrister at Six Pump Court Chambers in London and the legal director of UK LFI Charitable Trust. She speaks frequently on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. She holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities and was a fellow in the National Security Law Program at Columbia Law School in New York. Natasha previously worked for American law firm Skadden Arps in London and Brussels and clerked for the President of the Israeli Supreme Court, Chief Justice Miriam Naor, in Jerusalem. Natasha sits on the committee of the UK Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists and is a member of the JD Corps of the World Jewish Congress. So Natasha will be speaking to us today about issues to do with international law in Israel, which is an area that she knows very well. So I'll hand over to her, and there will be an opportunity at the end for questions. If I can ask people to put questions in the chat so that we can go in order, there'll be an opportunity to do that in about 40 minutes or so. Natasha, it's over to you.
Well, Alan and Jeremy, thank you very much indeed for your kind invitation to speak and for that introduction. I'm thrilled to see so many people who've zoomed into this. I appreciate we have very few, if any, lawyers with us. So in tackling the concept of international law vis-a-vis Israel, I'm going to seek to cover some of the basic key misrepresentations that have been levelled against Israel. And I hope in that at least we can start off the discussion. I look forward to the questions that you may have either on the issues that I've been able to cover in the short time we've got to spend together, or any other aspects of international law and Israel. But as I say, it's a pleasure to be with you to start at least to push back on some of the key misrepresentations about international law and Israel. And you will often hear that Israel violates international law. Allegations seem to be thrown around with little basis or justification or explanation. And I think the difficulty in being able to process and grapple with these concepts is that to many people, international law is quite a mysterious topic. And it can therefore be quite easy to misrepresent what international law says on a particular subject. I noted that in Alan's introduction, he referenced, of course, B'nai B'rith International's work in Israel and in Ukraine. And I think the situation that's developing in Ukraine is very pertinent to the discussion that we have on international law and its application to Israel, because it's certainly my impression that the manner in which international law is abused with regard to Israel has repercussions outside of the case of Israel. It devalues international law. And unfortunately, I think we've been seeing the repercussions of that and the effect on the validity of international law, how seriously it's taken, and the ability of international law, therefore, to have a meaningful impact where there are real violations of international law occurring, as in the case of Russia's war in Ukraine. But it's worth saying as a sort of aside at the beginning that this is clearly an area where politics and law often overlap. It's also an area where there's a special language of condemnation that's developed specifically for Israel. These terms, illegal settlements, inextricably linked with illegal occupation, are unique with respect to their use with respect to Israel. And I hope over the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to be able to explain to you why they're in fact contrary to what international law actually says. And in covering the topic of territory in international law, I want to look firstly at what international law says about the formation of states and their territory. And then I want to look at a couple of key examples of the application of international law and territory in the case of Jerusalem and in the case of the settlements in the disputed territories. But before that, a very brief overview on international law. It's very different to domestic law. It's a body of rules, law and custom that is recognized by states as being binding on them in their relations with each other. And there are two key sources of international law that I want to introduce you to for our purposes. The first is treaties. So that's like a contract between the states. It's a law, a form of law that states sign themselves up to and bind themselves to. And the other big source of international law I want to talk about is what's called custom. Now, custom is a bit of a strange beast. It's something that evolves over time, but when there's a practice that has become recognized as states engage in that practice and do so believing it to be binding on them, after a certain point, that practice becomes binding on them in the form of customary international law. And I'm going to be looking at one key example of that, which I hope will make the concept of custom a little bit clearer. So a further aside before we get into the meat of it is a word on UN resolutions. Many people cite United Nations resolutions as being indicative of international law or binding the international law, and for the vast majority of them, they're not. The legal status of a UN resolution is determined by the body that's made it. So is that the General Assembly or the Security Council? General Assembly resolutions are never legally binding. They are political statements. Security Council resolutions are very rarely legally binding, only if they are made under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Now, Chapter 7 is the strongest legal tool in the UN box. It is immediately binding on all states, and because of that, it's very rarely used. So a couple of examples of this are Resolution 678 in 1990 with respect to Iraq. The Security Council gave Iraq a set period to withdraw from Kuwait, after which it empowered states to use all necessary means to force Iraq out after that deadline. And of course, another very famous example of a Chapter 7 UN Security Council resolution is Resolution 1373, which was a response to the 9/11 terror attacks. It was famously made under that Chapter 7 rubric, so as to be immediately binding on all member states in its response to terrorism. With those asides done, let's look at the status of the territory where Israel is concerned. And as I promised, a really critical rule of customary international law that establishes the borders of newly emerging states at the moment of independence, as in Israel's case in 1948. So this rule is universally applied. It developed in the 19th century in South America. It was later applied in Asia and in Africa. And later, it also applied at the disintegration of the former communist federations. And it's applied to states that emerged in all of those contexts, and critically, in a context of decolonization. It also applied to states emerging from mandates, the mandate for Mesopotamia when it became the Kingdom of Iraq, the mandate for Syria, Lebanon, really in all of states that were emerging from mandates. This rule determined the borders of those newly emerging states at the critical date, that Declaration of Independence. And that rule dictated that the states took on the pre-existing administrative lines of the units that preceded them as their international borders. That rule is called uti possidetis juris. It is the default rule, so it applies whenever there is no agreement to the contrary. And the International Court of Justice, when it was discussing the formation of this rule, talked about a number of reasons that the rule had come into formation. In particular, to provide certainty, to avoid frontiers being challenged, to avoid wars breaking out, and to promote peace and stability. Those were the reasons the ICJ recognized as being behind the development of this fundamental rule. Now, another fundamental principle of international law is its equal application. You cannot have a general rule and an exception for a country that you just don't like very much, or you have some political or ideological opposition to. That is not how any respectable legal system can operate. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what does this rule, universally applied, tell us about the legal status of territory in Israel's case? Well, in 1948, the administrative lines of the eastern side of the British Mandate ran along the Jordan River and all the way to the south. And what I will seek to do now is share a couple of maps, which I'm sure our audience will be quite familiar with. This was the original mandate for Palestine. And of course, this part of the mandate was severed, and it later became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, which meant that what was left of the British mandate, you will be able to see from the next slide that I share, better delineated here. After the severance of Transjordan, we have the eastern boundary of the mandate, British Mandate of Palestine, which ran along the Jordan River and all of the way to the south to the Red Sea. Now, those are the pre-existing administrative lines just before Israel declared independence. And according to the rule of uti possidetis iuris, the administrative lines that you see on that slide are those that Israel would have inherited as its borders post-independence. It's worth noting also that Jordan's borders also followed the rule of uti possidetis iuris. And the reason that that line is so significant in Israel's case is, as the only state to emerge from the Mandate territory in 1948, applying that rule, Israel automatically assumes as its recognized international border the territory that includes East Jerusalem and the West Bank, because that is incorporated in that administrative line. Now, of course, that territory was occupied by Jordan in 1948 in Israel's War of Independence. And those same areas, as I'm sure our audience will be familiar with, were then recovered by Israel in 1967. But applying that rule, Israel has been the underlying sovereign since 1948. There's been no agreement of transfer of any kind of sovereignty since 1948. And the legal status is important because it tells us that Israel's presence after 1967 is entirely lawful and crucially not on the application of this rule, not a situation of occupation, which is a question I want to come on to a little bit later. I caveat all of this by saying that this legal analysis of the status of the territory is really important for us to know, what rules apply, what legal framework applies properly under international law in various different aspects of the territory. It's not an argument that this should foreshadow or mandate any political solution. And in fact, the one thing that the international community and Israel and the Palestinian leadership do agree on, it seems, is that there has to be a negotiated political resolution to the situation. And so the answers in that respect won't come from the law, but the reason that the proper application of the law is so important is that it puts the lie to so many of the political slogans masquerading as legal terminology that we so frequently hear in discussions and debates on this topic. Now, I mentioned the concept of occupation. The framework of the law of occupation, which developed in public international law, is important because its development was to protect the rights of a sovereign during a period in which they had been ousted from their territory. Even if one were to quibble, therefore, with the application of the universal rule, uti possidetis iuris, to Israel, and reject its application, to say that essentially universal rules don't apply to Israel for some reason, there is, in the context of Israel's recovery of this territory in 1967, no legitimate sovereign that has been ousted from their territory, which is traditionally required for the application, the formal de jure application of the law of occupation to be triggered. So the reason the question of the law of occupation is important is because it is in that context that we, as international lawyers, apply the Geneva Conventions. And I'll come on to why those are so significant in a few moments. But the bottom line, even if one rejects the application of the universal rule of uti possidetis juris, is that there is no sovereign from which Israel required the land from Jordan, which controlled that territory between 1967 and, forgive me, I'm going to stop the sharing the map because we're through with that at this point. There is no other sovereign from which Israel acquired that territory. There is no sovereign that had been ousted from that territory, and therefore the application of the law of occupation is very difficult to justify in a formal sense. What Israel did in 1967 when it recovered that property in areas of the disputed territories was to apply aspects of the law of occupation as part of a temporary administrative framework, and we can certainly come on to the pros and cons of that in questions after, if that's of interest. But critically, the absence of a prior sovereign is one difficulty with saying there is a situation of occupation. There is another huge difficulty with applying the framework of occupation nowadays, and that is because ever since 1994 there has been a peace agreement between Israel and Jordan, and no situation of occupation in the history of international law, so far as I have ever come across, has outlived a peace agreement. Because in the traditional application of the law of the legal framework of occupation, after that sovereign who'd been ousted from its territory makes peace with the holder of that territory, a situation of occupation is at an end, and a new framework takes place on the basis of that agreement, that peace treaty. That was importantly recognized even in the famous US Hansel Memorandum on Settlements that was famously reversed by Secretary of State Pompeo in the last American administration. But even that memorandum that had previously been used by people to argue that settlements were illegal recognized that a peace agreement with Jordan would render that situation an entirely different one. So that is a bit of an overview of the general picture of the law on territory. I want to come on to run through a couple of brief examples, and the first is Jerusalem, which is pretty critical. And to ask, what did Israel do with respect to its legal rights in Jerusalem? Because Israel's Declaration of Independence doesn't contain any reference to territory other than Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And in December 1949, the Knesset decided that that Jerusalem would be the capital of Israel. On the 26th of December 1949, the Knesset held its first session in West Jerusalem. And in 1950, in January, the Israeli parliament again declared that Jerusalem was the capital of the state of Israel. So in 1967, when Israeli forces ousted Jordanian forces from East Jerusalem and the West Bank, the war that ended on the 10th of June, Israel immediately took steps to apply its law, administration, and jurisdiction over the whole of Jerusalem, using the terminology areas formerly part of mandatory Palestine. And that formulation, I think, is significant when we consider the importance of uti possidetis juris and the application of the previous administrative lines of the mandate. Everything seems to be harkening back to that. In particular, of course, also the ceasefire agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan in 1949, and then subsequently the peace agreements between Israel and those respective neighboring states. Another significant aspect of Jerusalem and what happened in 1967 is that in July 1967, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Abba Eban, informed the UN Secretary General in writing that Israel's actions, so if you recall that application of law, administration, jurisdiction to Jerusalem, those actions did not constitute annexation. The Foreign Minister was very clear to the UN Secretary General on that. And the Israeli Supreme Court has considered the legal status of Jerusalem, famously in the 1993 case, the Temple Mount Faithful Association and the Attorney General, in which Justice Menachem Elon gives what is considered to be the most comprehensive discussion of the status of Jerusalem. The court emphasized the Temple Mount is part of the territory of the State of Israel, that the sovereignty of the state extends over unified Jerusalem in general and over the Temple Mount in particular, and therefore all of the laws of Israel apply to the Temple Mount, including those laws guaranteeing freedom of worship, right of access to and protection against the desecration of holy places. Again, Temple Mount is another very sensitive topic. I'm very happy to delve into that in more detail in questions. But the final topic that I want to address in terms of territory and international law is the issue of settlements. And I'm certain that you have all and will all encounter time and again the allegation that Israeli settlements are illegal. This is an argument that is based specifically on the application of the Fourth Geneva Convention to the West Bank. This is why I mentioned the Geneva Conventions were significant to our discussion. And the application of Geneva 4 is predicated on defining a situation of occupation in the disputed territory. Now, I've already gone through why, at a sort of general application of law level, I think that is extremely problematic legally and factually. But even if we set that aside, I want to look at the specific part of the Geneva Convention that is raised by those that argue that Israeli settlements are illegal, contravention of international law, and that is Article 49(6) of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which states, the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population in the territory it occupies. This is the basis for criticism of settlements, and it is, I think, the first thing to understand with respect to this Article 49(6) is the mischief that it was designed to counter. The context in which this article was drafted was the aftermath of the Second World War and the forced transfer of populations by the Nazi regime. So the full text of Article 49, first 5 paragraphs, are concerned with individual or mass forcible transfer. And the article was directed against the heinous practice of the Nazi regime during its occupation of Europe, of forcibly transporting populations of which it wished to rid itself into or out of occupied territories for the purpose of killing them or to provide slave labor. Now that reading is reinforced with reference to the preparatory materials of the convention, the travaux préparatoires, so the discussions surrounding its drafting, which indicate that amendments were proposed and debated in the context of the transfer of populations against their will. Importantly, the restriction incorporated into the Geneva Convention by this article is a restriction on government action. So what is being ignored in much of the debate about Israeli settlements is the fact that these are Israeli communities in the West Bank that arose through individuals and collectives moving to the area after 1967 of their own volition and as an expression of their own personal choice. The restriction on transfer as a restriction on government action is significant because it's not a requirement that government stop civilians from moving into an area, although, as an aside, it's important to note the Israeli government has done exactly this, where it had a legal basis on which to remove individuals who were either settling on private land or doing so in a situation without planning authority. Now, the spontaneous movement of Israeli nationals to this area, even if you look past all of the difficulties of the application of the Geneva Conventions to the disputed territories, even if you look past the real purpose of the articles as they were drafted, individuals moving of their own free will would simply not trigger the text of Article 49.6. And I think the proof of the pudding really is in how Israel is treated on this question in relation to other states. As lawyers, we always operate on the basis of precedent. And in order to find an answer to a legal issue, you don't necessarily just reason through the facts of your own particular case, but you look to other cases. You look to where the law has been applied in similar cases, and you draw your conclusions from those parallels. Now, there is a seminal piece of work by Professor Eugene Kontorovich, who has done exactly this on the question of settlements. I already indicated that a fundamental principle of international law is its equal application. But nowhere else do we see these issues of illegal settlements being raised in situations which would actually arguably fit the prohibition under Article 49.6, situations of real occupation and real transfer. So places unlike the West Bank, where occupation exists as contemplated by the Geneva Convention, and where government orchestrated settlement activity forms part of the policy of the belligerent occupier. In East Timor, in the context of the Indonesian occupation, which involved a large-scale settlement enterprise, which was explicitly aimed to change the demographic balance in the occupied territory. In Western Sahara, where Morocco's settlement program is one of the longest, largest, and most ambitious. In Northern Cyprus, where the Turkish occupation constitutes one of the most substantial settlement enterprises today, and it's particularly noticeable that this takes place within the territory of the European Union. During the Syrian occupation during the Syrian occupation in Lebanon, that involved mass movements of civilians into occupied territory between 1982 and 1990. In Cambodia, where several 100,000 Vietnamese settlers came to Cambodia during a decade of occupation by Vietnam between 1978 and 1990. In Azerbaijan, where the Nagorno-Karabakh region has historically had a substantial Armenian majority, Armenia encouraged substantial migration into that territory. And during Russia's occupation in Georgia, in Abkhazia, and of course in Ukraine, Crimea, where there have been centralized state-sponsored programs to settle people in the territory, the explicit purpose of which has been to change the demographics of that territory. So these are examples which often concerned a centralized state-sponsored program to settle people in the territory, the explicit purpose of which has been to change the demographics. And in many of these cases, these actions have been accompanied by large-scale human rights abuses. And in some cases, of course, those human rights abuses have occasioned large-scale international attention. In the case of Crimea, they involved also the imposition of sanctions on Russia. Those sanctions were, however, imposed for many other violations of international law. But no country, no international organization, no international human rights group, no one has said anything about Crimea settlers or even attempted to monitor the settlement activity. And that is a matter which Professor Kontorovich has gone into some detail in his research. In none of the situations, none of the examples I listed, has settlement activity been criticized as illegal. And it's not the case that these situations escaped international attention, because many international human rights organizations have been critical of the conduct. They've highlighted other human rights violations. But the failure to raise a legal objection to this question of settlements or the transfer of settlers or individuals is consistent in general. And actually, that's a key issue in international law, because when you have a practice which is consistent in general, as I explained in terms of custom, that also has implications for the development of international law after a sufficient passage of time. But this consistent and general failure to raise legal objections extends to the UN Human Rights Commission, the International Committee of the Red Cross, humanitarian NGOs like Human Rights Watch, whose work it is to systematically point out violations of these norms. So the lack of an international response to these activities has the effect of legitimizing the policy of government-orchestrated settlement projects in all of these situations. And that's because the development of public international law through custom is rooted in state practice. And when we consider that the only example in international law where the issue of settlements has been criticized as illegal is with regard to Israel, I think we have to ask ourselves whether the motion behind that criticism is in fact political rather than legal. I know I've covered quite a bit of material and I've done so quite quickly, but I wanted to leave a really good amount of time for questions to either delve into any of these issues in more detail or answer any questions that you may have on international law in Israel more generally. I know that there is a great debate at the moment with respect to developments in Israel legally, domestically. I'm happy to try and grapple with some of those points also, although I appreciate that may be the subject of a completely separate webinar. But Jeremy, I'm over to you to any questions that you may have or those that have already been coming in.
Thank you, Natasha. And you certainly introduced a lot of informative material there, and it's a thought-provoking discussion. There will, I'm sure, be other questions, but maybe I can sort of kick off because every year we, as in B'nai B'rith internationally, we have a delegation to Geneva and Paris. We go to see diplomats at UNESCO and also at the UN Human Rights Council, and we are often primarily focusing on the issue of anti-Israel bias. So, for example, at the UN Human Rights Council, we've got our Item 7. Israel is singled out for criticism. Every other country is dealt with under Item 4. Israel alone is dealt with under one separate agenda item. And that's actually replicated across many other UN agencies. We do raise this issue of double standards. We do raise the issue of, you criticize Israel's settlements, you don't criticize any other settlements, you don't condemn them as illegal and so on. I mean, is this just not a prime example of how these international bodies are just they're hemorrhaging credibility because they have this single-minded, obsessive focus on one country to the exclusion so often of many other genuine cases, whether of human rights abuses? Is just not a prime example of how they're hemorrhaging any sense of credibility?
So I'd say it's actually quite a bit worse than that. And I have said this at the UN Human Rights Council in the plenary sessions on Item 7. Because my real concern is that this abuse of international law is not just singling Israel out to the exclusion of any attention anywhere else. The inversion of international law and the double standards that are applied against Israel has the effect of, and I started referencing this right at the beginning, just before the substantive remarks, I think it has the effect of devaluing international law. It has the effect of lessening the impact because people will take what international law says less seriously because it has been so blatantly politicized and misapplied. And I think one prime example where we're seeing this negative, damaging effect is in how seriously people take international law vis-a-vis what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And also how seriously other international actors take their own violations of international law, because these allegations are being leveled falsely, and I think clearly falsely, not just at the UN but also at international legal organizations around the world. And I think it's a bit of an open secret. You see this in terms of Israel's diplomatic relations with other states, and in particular with the relations between Israeli diplomats and other diplomats, that on a personal level may be very positive and collegiate, but then when it comes to the voting, whether or not the facts say one thing, it's perfectly clear what those state representatives of countries that are hostile to Israel are expected to do in the context of the voting and the legal terminology that they're using in order to substantiate their condemnations. So it's become a little bit of a game, a process which they go through. But the real damaging impact is that, well, again, there were sort of two separate aspects to this. First, I would say, is in terms of what impact this has on international law more generally. But the other issue I'd like to highlight is that there's a reason that international law is being misapplied against Israel in order to justify the attacks on the only Jewish state. This has been carefully thought through and orchestrated. It was the subject of an op-ed by Mahmoud Abbas, already I think in 2011 in the New York Times, where he called for the internationalization of the conflict as a legal matter, not just a political one.
Yeah.
So this is a carefully orchestrated and well thought through campaign that involves NGOs, organizations at UN level, and staffers there to generate legal or quasi-legal materials condemning Israel in order to generate both political and legal follow-up activity on them. And we are seeing this manifest itself not just in the Human Rights Council, but also now at the International Court of Justice with respect to the General Assembly's referral to the court for an advisory opinion. We are also seeing it play out in the International Criminal Court and the investigation that is being conducted there. And I'm sure we will see similar issues develop across other international legal organizations.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I share those views. Good. Well, look, we've had one question from Dr. Jacob Schmidt. So perhaps, Jacob, if you could unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you, Natasha, for your excellent presentation, explanation about international law. Could you talk a little bit about Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, and the status there? Thank you so much.
Certainly. I mentioned the Temple Mount Faithful Association and the Attorney General case. That is the main statement, if you will, in terms of that the highest legal authority in Israel on Israeli underlying sovereignty there. And I mentioned in the context of that case that all of the laws of Israel guaranteeing freedom of worship, right of access and protection against desecration with respect to the holy places apply, therefore, to Temple Mount. The eagle-eared amongst the audience may have perked up at that point because, of course, one key difficulty with respect to Israel's policy with respect to the Temple Mount at the moment is that there isn't freedom of religion for Jews and indeed Christians on Temple Mount, but critically Jews, as it's certainly a place of real significance in Judaism. And that is a concession that has been made by Israel to in 1967 to the Waqf Authority, supported by Jordan, so-called the status quo, which is of course also misrepresented and I think deeply misunderstood. But the prohibition, if you will, on Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, a concession that has been made for the purpose of peaceful coexistence, is a bit of an anomaly, and it's difficult to reconcile with the general application of Israeli law, which of course prohibits discrimination and provides freedom of access to holy places. So it's one of those uncomfortable situations where the authorities are having to muddle through. I don't know if that helps with the underlying law and how that perhaps is built upon with respect to the difficulties of the security situation. But one of the main reasons I fear that we frequently see Har HaBayit referred to by the international media as a point of tension or as a a spark of conflict is, of course, the importance that it has taken on in the international discourse. It's not separate from the legal issues. This is, I think, pure politics. That it is it's become a bit of a battle cry, and you hear, especially around the Arab world, references to Israeli activity on the Temple Mount, predicating what frequently are planned uprisings, disturbances, rockets being fired from Gaza, riots on the Temple Mount itself. They are frequently linked to allegations with respect to Israeli conduct on the Temple Mount. And that is something I think that we need to be alive to. It's not generally the case that is where tensions have started. And frequently there is clear evidence that issues have been brewing, matters have been planned in advance of the Temple Mount being used as an excuse in those contexts. Increasingly, I think the Israeli authorities are getting better at getting ahead of those situations and putting out the reality of the situation, but that doesn't always make it into the international media. Does that help, Jacob, or are there other aspects that I might be able to go into in terms of the Temple Mount?
No, thank you very much. Just could you just clarify what's the status of this concession? So is it possible to take it back? And in terms of international law, it is potentially, in my view, a treaty or a concession rather than international law. But perhaps you could explain that. Thank you very much.
It certainly. So one of the key questions as to whether or not Israel might be able to go back on something like that, a representation like that, is arguably the principle of estoppel. But that requires the counterparty, if you will, to have relied on Israel's promise to its detriment. I don't think realistically that a wholesale reversal of the Waqf authority on the Temple Mount is something that would certainly be easy to do, and I don't see it on the cards at all. There's no Israeli government that has indicated that it is, as a matter of policy, it is something that it would seek to pursue. If there's an interesting question, I don't think there's a straightforward answer in terms of what Israel would be allowed to do in that context from an international law perspective. I think one of the key arguments will come down to this question of estoppel. But the international community's view of Jerusalem is far from clear. You may recall that the partition plan, which was never adopted and as a General Assembly resolution was never legally binding, did envisage that Jerusalem would come under, for a set period of time, an international jurisdiction. Now that set period of time is sort of long past, but there are those in the international legal world that argue still that Israel's jurisdiction over Jerusalem is unlawful, and I personally don't see a legal basis for that, especially given the application of uti possidetis juris. But inevitably, you will have a plethora of legal arguments being deployed, some on the basis that recognise Israeli jurisdiction over Jerusalem, and some on the basis that don't. So it's going to inevitably be a multifaceted and complex response. But the one thing I can tell you with surety is that there will be fierce opposition to it.
Thank you very much. I've got a question from Jacqueline Gross.
If you could unmute yourself, please.
Right. Am I unmuted?
We can hear you.
Right. Is that okay now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. How does international law regard territory gained in war?
Really good question, and I haven't covered that because I think the other aspects that I have covered preclude, if you will, that question, that analysis. But the general position is that there is a prohibition on the use of force. And that is the basis upon which it is accepted that the acquisition of territory through use of force is unlawful, if that makes sense. So it's the wrongful act that cannot allow you to obtain a positive, a benefit from that wrongful act.
I've had to go and charge it because I've got no.
Oh, could you?
Even
The problem is that not every use of force is unlawful. And the UN Charter recognises an inherent right to self-defence. So it's also generally accepted that acting in self-defence and using force in self-defence is not subject to general prohibition on the use of force. So then the question probably needs to be posed, well, what happens to territory that you acquire through using force in self-defence? And there are great debates in international law about this. Inevitably, you have to track through whether or not the use of force, when it began and as it continued, was a continuing act of self-defense. I imagine your question is related to Israel's defensive war in 1967 and the acquisition of territory, the disputed territories in that context. And that is where a lot of the debate about Israel's presence in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria stems from. There is a strong argument to say that Israel, if it acquires territory through a war, which is self-defensive, then that should not be unlawful. Double negative, but that's unfortunately the follow-through of the various provisions that I've outlined. I don't think we need to get there, though, simply because Israel doesn't acquire the territory through any use of force, lawful or unlawful. It recovers that territory in 1967 from Jordanian occupation. It was the Jordanians that acquired that territory through their unlawful use of force, through their illegitimate attack on the fledgling state of Israel. They occupied that territory in the 48-49 war. They ethnically cleansed it of Jews. And there's no argument that their purported annexation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank was recognized only by Pakistan. There is no international legitimacy to their presence in those territories until Israel recovered that territory. And so we don't need to get to the point where Israel is acquiring territory through use of force, because you cannot acquire what is already your own underlying sovereign territory. So I hope the answer and the qualifier to it.
Yes, where does that leave the Golan?
Yeah, I was going to say.
Okay, so the Golan Heights is a completely different situation. And there your question is even more pertinent because Israel, certainly I would argue, acquired that territory in a war of self-defense and is required to retain it for defensive purposes also. That has certainly been recognized by the United States. The question of the Golan Heights is rarely discussed, though, in legal terms, which is interesting, whereas you've got many manifestations of pseudo-applications of international law to the disputed territories, to Judea and Samaria and also to East Jerusalem. But the discussions about the Golan Heights are less legal and more practical. And I think even the harshest critics of Israel recognize what the situation would have been had Israel returned the Golan to Syria in the aftermath, of course, of what we have witnessed in the last couple of decades, even in Syria, and the situation that has been developing there. So I have seen many American international affairs commentators who are the first out of the starting gates to be extremely harsh critics of Israel that haven't suggested, in light of the developments of the last couple of decades, that Israel was wrong in practical, realistic terms to hang on to the Golan Heights. The international community, of course, through the monitoring and policing of the Golan, international peacekeepers between Israel and the Syrians, have acknowledged Israel's presence there. Certainly the occupied Golan Heights is still a phrase that is used. There, the concept of occupation, the framework of occupation certainly does have more legal validity. And so the arguments then come down to Israel's acquisition in a defensive war and the purposes for which it is required to hang on to that territory.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Jeff Wilson.
Sorry, can I just ask one more thing? What was that Latin phrase you used?
Uti possidetis juris. I can put it in the chat.
Yes, please.
And certainly can see if I can circulate a couple of articles on that and also on the settlements inquiry that I mentioned in the course.
Yes, things like lawfare, etc. That sort of thing. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff Wilson. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Assuming that the Palestinians one day elect a government that is prepared to negotiate its independence from Israel, would that mean the abandonment of the settlements and the end of the blockade on Gaza?
I didn't quite catch the beginning of that. Is it assuming?
Assuming that the Palestinians one day elect a government that is prepared to negotiate its independence from Israel, would that mean the abandonment of the settlements and the end of the blockade on Gaza?
Okay. Dealing with Gaza, firstly, if we were talking about the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, I can't see Hamas in your hypothetical jumping on board with that. And the blockade on Gaza is principally for the purpose of preventing materials that are going to be used either to expand and reinforce a terror tunnel network or to manufacture missiles, which occasionally Hamas and others, Palestinian Islamic Jihad more recently in the Gaza Strip, have fired onto Israeli civilians. So the blockade, I don't see, which isn't, I stress, on humanitarian provisions, I don't see that necessarily ending. With respect to, unless there's a complete about-face in the Gaza Strip, and I don't see that as, even in the hypothetical that you paint, likely. But to focus on the West Bank for a moment, if there were a Palestinian leadership that decided finally to seek a peaceful solution and negotiate, as you say, an independence, and I caveat that with, of course, the Palestinians in the West Bank already enjoy an autonomy in areas A and B as a result of the Oslo Accords, so they have self-government. But you're talking, I think, about a wider manifestation of that. And many times that is discussed in the context of the withdrawal of Israeli settlements, which I find on a moral level troubling, because it is predicated on this idea that Jews cannot live in certain areas because they're Jews. And it is predicated on any peaceful solution or any establishment of a Palestinian state requiring ethnic cleansing, requiring that that state be free of Jews, or Judenrein, as some I'm sure will be familiar with that phrase. That is, of course, a demand that has been made by the current Palestinian leadership. And bizarrely, it is a demand that finds favour with some of the international community. And certainly it is one that underpins, I believe, many of the arguments that settlements are illegal. It's extremely troubling. And it's bizarre that it's not addressed more frankly and dealt with in those particular terms. Likewise, the prohibition under the current Palestinian Authority of sale of land to Jews, which is punishable still on the statute books by death, although I believe the last the last individual found to have flouted this provision had his death sentence commuted to life imprisonment. But that is also a manifestation of a real difficulty in terms of the leadership's approach to Jews living in the territory. Likewise, I've just had another question's popped up, which I'm sure we'll move on to in a moment. But I mean, all of your question is certainly predicated on, the Palestinian Authority deciding to negotiate for its own independent state, or whatever manifestation that takes, other than the autonomy that they currently have. And I think it's just worth highlighting some of the difficulties that I think the Palestinian population face with respect to the current leadership and its incentive to seek a peaceful solution. Because Mahmoud Abbas and anyone that follows him requires the international nations that flood in as a result of the perpetuation of the conflict. They require for their political control and hold, the othering of Israel, the outside enemy, in order to buffet and maintain their own authoritarian control. And also a factor which escapes many people is that they require Israeli security cooperation in the West Bank to prevent a Hamas takeover there, in the same way that Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip, throwing their opposition Fatah members off of the roofs of buildings in the coup in which they seized power. So the likelihood of a situation of the Palestinian leadership deciding that actually, instead of perpetuating the conflict, it would seek to bring it to an end is difficult to imagine in those circumstances. And also in the context, when I visited Ramallah and met with some of the Palestinian leadership, but also visited projects out there, Ruabi, the first ever planned Palestinian town, and venture capital startup funds looking to create a Palestinian middle class. There's a clear message that I've taken away, which is that the best mid-term case scenario is that those efforts, those economic injections, create a Palestinian middle class that's vibrant, a stronger economy, and therefore an incentive to seek a peaceful solution, if not at the leadership level, then at least amongst the majority of the population. And in that context, I think the sort of hypothetical that you're setting up can come to fruition. I would be hopeful in that context that it's not one that requires, a removal of settlements or ethnic cleansing for peaceful coexistence to be maintained. And if you look at what's happened within Israel, the Arab minority that exists, and the very important part that the Arab minority takes, both in terms of the political and civic arena, but also at every level of society. When I was working at the Supreme Court, there was an Arab Supreme Court justice. There is now a subsequent Arab Supreme Court justice. They serve, of course, in the Knesset, in the police force, at various senior levels in the army also. So that in all of the key institutions in Israel, they are represented. And I know and speak with many of them that consider themselves to be Israelis and are extremely loyal to that state. The only Arabs living in a democracy in the Middle East, and they recognize that. So I think what you're perhaps alluding to, or maybe I'm reading too much into this, is that the best options, I think, are going to come from the population as opposed to the leadership in the near future. But let's hope that that's sooner rather than later.
We'll have to try. We'll literally have three more questions, which we'll try and get through in the next 10 minutes.
Sorry, I'll keep it a bit
That's
short.
absolutely fine. No. Your answers are very, very erudite and fascinating to listen to. Robert Shields, please.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
You can.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Fantastic presentation. Really, really clear. I wondered if you could say something about the rights, if there are any, to vote in the country in which they live of the Arab citizens in the West Bank, and particularly perhaps in East Jerusalem.
So I mentioned that the West Bank Palestinians have an autonomy, and the Palestinian Authority has complete control over Area A. It has civil control over Area B, and Israel maintains security control over Area B, and then Israel has full control over Area C. And within Area A and B of the West Bank, there is supposed to be an election for the Palestinian Authority. And unfortunately, I'm trying to think now, recall when the last elections.
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah, what about Area C though? What about those who live in Area C and in East Jerusalem?
Yeah, so the option for non-citizens of Israel that live in those areas is to vote for the Palestinian Authority. In East Jerusalem, Palestinians that are living there, Palestinian Arabs that are living there, have the ability to apply for residency. Not all of them take this up, but I think increasingly more do. And that, of course, doesn't give rights to vote in national elections. And I will need to double check this, but my recollection is that there is an ability to vote locally. So, for instance, in the same way that a French citizen living in London would not be permitted to vote nationally, but would be permitted to vote locally, there may be some provision for that. But you're absolutely right that non-citizens do not vote in national elections. The Knesset is voted for by Israeli citizens of every denomination. So an Arab vote counts just the same as a Christian or a Jewish vote.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit troubling, isn't it? That kind of anomalous that you painted this rather clear picture of those territories west of the Jordan and indeed of Jerusalem being under the United Nations resolutions and so on in 1948, part of Israel. Certainly not part, but occupied by Jordan. So recovered by Israel in 1957. So what about the people who live there? Yeah.
I just need to make one thing clear: nothing to do with the United Nations.
No.
So really important that because many people refer to Resolution 181, which is the UN partition plan, as indicative of some legal framework or territorial division, and that's not accurate because it was a recommendation by the General Assembly, which was flatly rejected by the local Arab population and also by Israel's surrounding Arab neighboring states. So we don't get anywhere legally through that. Where we do glean important legal framework from is this rule of uti possidetis juris. But all that tells us is the starting point of the legal status of the territory. It doesn't go further than that. And of course, immediately that Israel declared independence, it was attacked by the surrounding Arab states. And the corollary of that was that the areas that you have highlighted, East Jerusalem and the West Bank, were occupied by Jordan. And I mentioned ethnically cleansed of their Jews. And that situation has dramatically changed the position on the ground from 1949 onwards. When Israel recovered that territory, it didn't say this is all now recovered territory, this is all now from now on going to be Israel proper. What it did was it did so with respect to Jerusalem, and that's why the residential status is provided to Arab residents of East Jerusalem. But what it did with respect to the West Bank was institute a temporary administration of that territory in the anticipation that a peace agreement with Jordan would be struck, in which land for peace would be exchanged. And of course, that never happened because when peace was finally reached with Jordan in 1994, the Jordanians relinquished any claim. I would argue that they never had one, but they made it plain that they did not have any territorial interest in that territory, and they wished for Israel to come to an agreement instead with the Palestinian leadership. And that is something we are still waiting for. So we have to be quite careful to keep the legal analysis and the political realities and political negotiations separate, but be very clear about the legal analysis, because it tells us what the position is for the application of international law and provides, I think, that important context to recognise when we're being told things about international law that aren't accurate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Margaret Summers or David? Can you unmute? That's it.
Yes. Israel is often accused of being an apartheid state, and I just wondered if there was a legal definition of an apartheid state. I'm familiar with South Africa, and I'm not sure if that was legally defined either.
There is there are in fact two legal definitions of apartheid. One is the implementation and maintenance of a system of legalized racial segregation in which one racial group is deprived of political and civil rights. And it is under that, that's probably the most important one, because it's under that definition that apartheid is recognized as a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So if we look at that definition just for a moment, I promise I keep the answer short, the implementation and maintenance of a system of legalized racial segregation in which one racial group is deprived of political and civil rights. It's trite that doesn't apply to Israel. It's outrageous that this phrase, and as I'm speaking to you from South Africa, I feel the need to take extreme umbrage with the abuse of this particular legal term with respect to Israel. And this is I'm really glad that you've brought up this point, because I hadn't covered it, but this is the major battle in the phenomenon that I have been describing of political terms usurping legal terminology for these political purposes. I attended online a conference organised under UN auspices only a few weeks ago, where this issue was being discussed as the most important battleground against Israel. And the reason that the referral to the International Court of Justice now by the General Assembly has been made in the terms in which it has been made is that the expectation of the Palestinians and those states supporting them is that the advisory opinion the International Court of Justice delivers will reference apartheid and its application to Israel. Utterly falsely, utterly factually baseless. But their expectation is that the use of that term by a legal body, by the International Court of Justice, will enable Israel's detractors to continue to use it with legitimacy. And what comes after the application of the legal term apartheid? Sanctions and boycotts. And this is the raison d'etre of the BDS movement. It is the latest manifestation of that phenomenon that I addressed you on, that we can track all the way back to 2011 and that op-ed in the New York Times by Mahmoud Abbas. And it is the critical battleground, which is part of the reason I'm now in South Africa. But given that there is a legal definition, it ought to be applied, and it's not. The reports that we have had from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are an utter travesty in terms of the misrepresentations and the shameful absence of proper legal analysis in them. And again, this is part of politics overtaking law. And the reason I believe that South Africans should be particularly offended by this phenomenon with respect to the use of the term apartheid is that same process of minimizing the effect of international law, of devaluing legal processes and legal terminology, is now going to be replicated with respect to the term of apartheid. And I think that does a serious injustice to the reality of what went on over here.
Okay, I mean, before actually, if I could jump in, before I come to the last question, I will say that the only time that I've ever been confronted with the accusation of Israel being an apartheid state within the diplomatic community was actually in the South African High Commission, when the ambassador actually sort of said with favour that she believed that Israel was an apartheid state, or accepted that opinion. And I looked up at her wall and I saw a photograph of the great Nelson Mandela on her wall, and I pointed to that photograph and I said, well, if anybody, Your Excellency, if anybody knew what apartheid was, it was surely that man up there. And he said that Israel was not an apartheid state. So yes, he was critical of Israel for sure, but he said that definition didn't apply. I think in a way that was perhaps the most telling response that I could have given at that point. One last question from Menachem Briskman.
Right, hopefully I've unmuted myself.
Yes.
Good evening all. Essentially, at the end of 1948, Israel had certain territories, but all the boundaries were ceasefire lines. They were not boundaries. It's very easy to find the ceasefire agreements between Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon. And they were very clearly stated that these are not permanent boundaries. They are ceasefire lines for further negotiations. And the reason for that was very clearly that they will never recognize Israel. And we had to finish the war here because Israel won, but that's not the end of the story. Now, having said all that, does that make a legal argument for saying that if then they start another war, the ceasefire line moves and the boundaries de facto are where they are now, including the territories taken from Syria?
Not entirely. You're spot on in terms of the ceasefire agreements, and the reason it's a really important point, and I'm glad that you raised it, is that these so-called ceasefire lines are sometimes referred to as the 1967 borders, which are not borders, and neither do they date for 1967. When you hear that term, what it will actually mean is the 1949 ceasefire lines. And you are absolutely right that every single one of those ceasefire agreements was as clear as they could be that they did not constitute borders, because the relevant parties signing with Israel did not recognize Israel's existence in any borders, and were perfectly open about their intention to continue to try their hardest to wipe Israel off of the map. But one other aspect of ceasefire agreements, which is critical, which I think answers your question as to what the de facto lines are, is that every single one of those ceasefire agreements references the previous boundary of the Mandate Palestine. That was the last agreed upon boundary, the last valid boundary in international law. And that's significant for the application of uti possidetis juris, because the reason that it's the previous administrative lines of whatever unit preceded the new state that are carried forward is because those are the lines that have international legitimacy. Those are the lines that maintain stability and security and certainty and prevent fratricidal struggles. So it's not the case that after every war the boundaries shift. If that was the case, then the acquisition of territory through the use of force in war, would gain in legitimacy. In fact, Israel really has the answer that it needs in terms of what its original boundaries were through the rule of uti possidetis juris. To the extent that it enters into subsequent agreements with states to amend those, that is entirely legitimate, that is entirely lawful. Remember that uti possidetis juris is a default rule. It applies where there is no other agreement to the contrary. But as you say, given that the ceasefire agreements made it clear there was no agreement as to boundaries, given that there has been no subsequent agreement on boundaries or sovereignty, we go back to those mandatory lines as international law dictates.
Thank you.
That's great. Well, thank you for all those questions. And can I say, Natasha, thank you for a most stimulating and informative talk on an area in which you clearly have a great deal of expertise. I think you've reminded us of the unique ways in which Israel is condemned, especially in regard to issues of settlements and territory, and I think the double standards are glaring. You've shown how principles of international law are so often kind of twisted and ignored and misunderstood. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to stand up to the kind of mountain of lies that have been erected by the anti-Israel movement and replace it with a narrative that's based on kind of truth and evidence and logic. And you've done that with tenacity, and Lawyers for Israel have done it with tenacity, and that's why I'm very glad that our organisations are working together so effectively and will continue to do so. So can I ask everyone here to just offer their thanks to Natasha for a most stimulating discussion this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you